For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. For more information, visit faith.yale.edu.
The star brings the Magi to the edges of their wisdom. It forces them to look over the precipice of everything they know about the way stars and astral bodies behave. It brings them to the limits of their own knowledge and forces them to entertain the possibility that something is happening beyond their understanding.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Merry Christmas, friends. For this week, we're dropping a double dose of Christmas reflections, some Christmas joy, if you will, from the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. We'll be hearing from Matt Croasmun and Drew Collins, both of whom are associate research scholars and lead our Life Worth Living and Christ and Flourishing initiatives, respectively. In this episode, I interviewed Drew Collins about the Magi of the Gospel of Matthew, Chapter 2. These three kings from the Orient, from the East, come to pay Jesus homage. But in so doing, they offer for us an outside perspective on the wonder and the weirdness of Christmas. They've been lauded through the centuries of Christian theology for both their reason and their faith. But W.H. Auden's treatment of their intentions in his beautiful Christmas Oratorio, For the Time Being, it brings into clearest, brightest view why they followed the star and offers us something to aspire to. Auden gives them these lines: to discover how to be truthful now, to discover how to be living now, to discover how to be loving now, to discover how to be human now is the reason we follow this star. And well, in that sense, we're all Magi, trying to learn how to be human now. Here's my conversation with Drew, and don't forget to check out our other Christmas episode with Matt Croasmun, where he reflects on the connection between Santa, God, and the obligation to be happy. Drew, my friend, I'm glad you're jumping on the show today.
Oh, Evan, it's good to be here. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. Recently, we were talking about the Magi. You produced this really fascinating take on the three wise men that most people are familiar with from Christmas pageants, or maybe the hymn, "We three kings of Orient are bearing gifts, we traverse afar." You know, that's a sort of tame, quaint, more familiar version of what's really going on there. And so I think it's time for you to clarify a little bit. Who were the Magi really, and like how should we kind of reorient our familiarity with them?
The story of the Magi is one of those stories, I think, that is so present to us. And it's so much a part of our sort of mental and spiritual furniture, especially around Christmas, that we just sort of take it for granted. But it's a much weirder story, I think, than we give it credit for. The story of the Magi is only told in the Gospel of Matthew. Most New Testament scholars will tell you that the Gospel of Matthew was written for a community of Jewish Christians and who were experiencing some difficult issues around where they belonged, whether they'd been expelled from synagogues, and it was sort of tumultuous time for them in terms of finding their community. In the midst of this gospel, written for a predominantly Jewish Christian community, the very first people who are said to recognize Jesus, apart from the angels and his parents, are these non-Jews, presumably these Persians.
Okay, so Matthew 2:1. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage."
Yes.
Now, so, I mean, as you say, these are Persians. They're coming from outside the Jewish community, and they're the first to recognize the Christ child. And we don't really know exactly what's meant by wise men, perhaps, but I wonder if you'd say, like, what is significant to you about the fact that it's Persians, it's Gentiles who are recognizing Jesus as king first?
There's a little bit of mystery when it comes to what exactly it is to be a magi. It's not entirely clear. And it could just mean that they were astrologers. They could even have been Zoroastrian priests, which, as you say, they are non-Jews. They're Gentiles. And not only do they come to pay homage to the King of the Jews, interestingly, important to say, not their king, but they come and they alert the Jews to the birth of the King of the Jews, namely the ostensive king of the Jews, Herod. Their whole interaction with Herod is absolutely fascinating and mystifying, because it's what motivates the Magi to come to Herod is a star rising. Now, we have no idea how they knew that this star was to be associated with the king, much less the King of the Jews. But it's also made clear that Herod and none of the other Jews had noticed it. So the Magi see something that the Jews don't see. And yet, when they bring this to Herod consults with his scribes and priests, and they tell him, they consult scriptures, and they say, yes, in Bethlehem of Judea, this is where the Messiah is to be born, which is information that the Magi would not have had. They weren't Jews. They weren't reading Jewish scripture or the prophets. So there's this exchange between the Magi and Herod and his priests. They're coming to understand something that is happening in the world by virtue of their sharing of information. And so Herod passes on. Herod and the wise men, Herod and his priests pass on this information gleaned from Scripture. Go find him in Bethlehem. But he needs the Magi still to show him where in Bethlehem to find Jesus, the King.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you're right to call the story mystical and strange. Just what the nature of the star is, what makes it recognizable to them as having this kind of Jewish theological significance. But then they're warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. They go back to their own country by another road. So it's sort of, the entire thing is shrouded in secrecy, obviously to protect the Christ child from the authority and prevent King Herod from killing Jesus.
That's right.
So the whole thing is shrouded in a kind of mysticism, and it sort of lends to the to something I've long thought, which is that Christmas is weird and strange, and it's deeply spiritual. It's deeply mystical at its core.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. Because I wouldn't describe it as mystical so much as miraculous, and that sort of goes without saying, I suppose. A lot of the interpretation of the Magi and a lot of what's been written about them has attributed to them a certain firmness of knowing, a kind of certainty that came from their responding to following the star.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Pope Benedict describes them in a similar way. He says, the Magi represent the inner dynamic of religion towards self-transcendence, which involves a search for truth, a search for the true God, and hence philosophy in the original sense of the word. They represent the religions moving toward Christ, as well as the self-transcendence of science toward him. They represent, not only do they represent the people who have found the way to Christ, they represent the inner aspiration of the human spirit, the dynamism of religions and human reason toward him.
Yeah.
Now, I hesitate to push back against Pope Benedict, but I have to say I really disagree with that reading.
And why?
Because I think it gives the Magi the wrong kind of credit.
Yeah.
which is, I differentiate that between saying too much credit. I think the Magi deserve an enormous amount of credit for leaving their home, leaving their country, following this star, all to pay homage to a king whose authority over them, as I think we'll talk about, at least would have been unclear who this king was and why it was important to pay him, why it was important to pay him homage. But they do.
Right.
But at the same time, again, the exchange, the way in which the star doesn't just lead them to Bethlehem, it leads them to Jerusalem. It leads them to a place where they have to inquire of other people. They have there's information that they lack, that the star is at this point not providing them. Right there, we are confronted with the realization that the Magi are not self-sufficient. Whatever call, whatever journey they are called to embark upon, it is not just a matter of them navigating by virtue of the star. The star calls them into these series of exchanges.
So what can we learn from the Magi in terms of, their intellectual, their spiritual, their moral stance in response to the light of this star, whatever it is, and whoever they are? The scripture in Matthew is presented to us with an opportunity to see how these righteous searchers responded to God's call. And I wonder what you think we ought to be focusing on and what we ought to learn from the Magi.
Rather than describe the Magi's pursuit or following of the star as a function of their knowledge and their wisdom, I would say it reveals that their wisdom lay precisely in their ability to confront and embrace the limits of their knowing, of their own certainty. The star does not behave like any star they would have encountered before. The star stands as an exception, obviously, a massive exception to the way stars and astral bodies normally behave.
Of course.
So rather than a sort of an affirmation of the wisdom of astrology, this is, I think the star stands in some senses as a rebuke. The star brings the Magi to the edges of their wisdom. It forces them to look over the precipice of everything they know about the way stars and astral bodies behave. It brings them to the limits of their own knowledge and forces them to entertain the possibility that something is happening beyond their understanding. And it's important to say at the same time, they were alerted. They were alerted to that by attending to their science, by attending to their astrology. It was because they were paying attention to the sky that they saw this star. So there's a certain affirmation of what they were doing, of their sort of concern for creation, their attentiveness to the world around them. But at the same time, there's an undermining of the extent to which that will provide them with the knowledge that they need, the knowledge of who Jesus is.
Yeah. One of the things that you were telling me about this when we first talked about it was that they were working with a kind of incomplete knowledge. And I really like this idea of just holding their wisdom lightly, their approach to their own wisdom, even though they're presented as wise men in the scriptures, their approach to their own wisdom was quite humble, and it focused more on the learning, on the inquisitiveness, on paying attention and searching.
Yes, and it stands as a rebuke, their openness to the closedness of Herod and the scribes, who turn to search the scriptures and encounter, of course, the information that they had that was at their fingertips all along. The Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. But it takes the Magi's question to alert the people who have all the information at their fingertips.
What I really like about the way that you approach the Magi and their relation, especially to, the Jewish authorities, King Herod and their closedness, sometimes you need a kind of alien or foreign or strange.
Oh man.
These strangers need to come in and and offer a new, fresh perspective. And that's one thing that their searching and their way of approaching this strange star changes the situation.
That's exactly right. The more I read this story, the more I am filled with the sort of conviction that if I am like any of the characters, any of the people in the story, I am like Herod and the scribes. I am the one who has become so used to the scripture and so familiar with it that I am often not able to discern the ways in which it speaks to the new things that God is doing.
So when you get that perspective from the other, it allows you to re-envision your own faith, and you have an opportunity to respond with wisdom, or you have an opportunity to respond with fear. And obviously King Herod responded with fear. We got to talk about the concept of gift, because besides their wisdom and just coming from a far off land, the three wise men, the Magi, are associated with gold and frankincense and myrrh. And I wonder if I think you've rightly said, like, the symbolism or the allegory or whatever those might, whatever approach people have taken to interpreting that might miss the point. I wonder, you've talked a little bit more about like the broader theology of gift behind that. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the concept of the Magi's gift to Christ and what that says about God.
Yes. Well, there's just this extraordinary, again, this is non-Jews, these Gentiles, who at the conclusion of the story, we have no reason to think that they have any real understanding of who it is they've just met. They call him the King of the Jews, but that could mean, as we know, that could mean any number of things, depending on how you understand the kingship. They come and they bring these three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We're taught as Christians that God is the gift giver. It is God who gives the gift of life to the world and the gift of God's love. God is the fount of creation, and everything comes from God. And yet here we have these non-Jews giving gifts to God. We focus so much on the giving of the gifts, but we don't ever talk about the fact that God received them. I think that, one way of saying that is God's giving is so radical, it's so total, that even in God's receiving the gifts that we bring, however paltry and imperfect they are, God is also giving.
Huh.
And what he is giving in receiving the gifts of the Magi, God's giving us the hope that our own lives, scruffy and flawed, might be received by others as giving, like the Magi, greater insight into who Jesus is, and might be received and redeemed by God in the coming of God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. The gifts of the Magi give to Jesus help us to understand who Jesus is. The reason why we talk so much about gold, frankincense, and myrrh is that they actually had symbolic value. Gold was given, was the gift for a king. Frankincense was used religious occasions and rituals. It was a gift for a priest. And myrrh was used to anoint the corpses. And so in these three gifts from that the Magi bring to the baby Jesus, we just get a glimpse of who this baby is and will be. He is the king. He is the priest. And he's also the corpse, the one who will die for the world. What I would want to say is that in this story where we have, it is safe to say that they could not have known that those gifts would reflect these particular aspects of Jesus's identity. And that's the miracle. That's the thing that floors me when I read this, and that I'm so excited about and moved by, is that God deems those gifts. God makes those gifts and uses them to help us to understand who God is. He gives us the opportunity to give gifts to God.
What I love about it, and the way I'd like just to kind of encapsulate it, is God's receiving the gift is this beautiful act of grace and giving in itself.
Well said. Yes.
It's a way of receiving us. So in that sense, it's this beautiful picture of our relation to God, that when we encounter God, even at the level of our devotion or our worship or giving, it's fundamentally founded on God's own grace and gift. And I think you really bring that light to it.
God gives, he gives, his grace extends into the most quotidian and mundane aspects of our lives, our sort of, our professions, nothing is safe in a sense from God's own sort of self-giving.
Drew, this is refreshing. It's wonderful to kind of view Christmas through different lenses every year. We sort of get stuck in grooves of thinking about the Christmas story, the nativity, in honestly worn out ways. But I think what you're bringing here is a way that breathes new life into the way we view these three wise men. So thanks for joining me to tell me about it. Evan,
this is going to be a particularly weird Christmas, unfortunately for most people.
Yeah.
And so I think it is only fitting that we try on a slightly weird reading of what is such a familiar story.
That's right. Thanks, Drew.
Thanks, Evan.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured theologian Drew Collins. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edited and produced the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. We produce a new episode every Saturday, and you can subscribe through any podcast app. We're grateful that you're listening to this podcast. We're passionate about making this work consistently accessible to people who are genuinely concerned about the viability of faith in a world racked with division, contested views about what it means to be human, and what it means to live life well. If you're in a position to support our show financially and are looking for some year-end opportunities, please consider partnering with us. We rely on the generosity of individuals like you to make our work possible. And if you're not, please continue listening and engaging the content. Let us know what you're interested in. We're grateful that you're listening. But if you can give, if you're truly passionate about supporting podcasting that's all about pursuing, really living lives that are worthy of our humanity, then consider a gift to the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit faith.yale.edu/give or find the link in the show notes to make a year-end contribution. It's our joy to bring these shows to you, and we'd invite you to bring that same joy in supporting this work. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with more next week.